that we have about change in our culture. We know some things about change, and they're all fairly depressing. We know that change is hard. We know that change is futile. You can't teach an old dog new tricks. You might as well not even try. We know that people resist change, and indeed that people hate change. So why are we so optimistic about our changes? Well, I want to suggest that the conventional wisdom is not completely true, cannot be completely true, because if that were true, then ketchup would still be the #1 selling condiment in the United States, whereas for a number of years now, it's actually been salsa. Now, I want you to imagine you're a brand manager 15 years ago, and somebody gave you the task of displacing the most beloved sauce in American cooking with stuff that makes your mouth burn when you eat it. Who would have tackled that change challenge? If change were so difficult, then phoning would still mean this rather than this, and text would mean that rather than that. Well, that's what Dan and I set out to write about. So I write books with my brother Dan. It's a weird hobby. Some brothers, fix cars together. Some hunt together. We write business books together. It's worked out for us, but it's kind of quirky. And what we started out with was we knew that we weren't exactly resistant to change, but there is this internal argument that goes on every time we have a change. And that argument is kind of interesting because it's like we have two selves. One self wants the better beach body come summer. But there's another self that's in charge when they open up the cupboard and sees the Oreo cookies, and that self really wants an Oreo cookie. Part of us may love the idea of changing something at work, but there's another part of us that's in love with the comfort and the confidence of that existing routine. Now, this is not a new observation with the Heath brothers, and so for years psychologists talked about the analytical side of our brains that help us analyze the world, and then the emotional side of our brain that falls in love with the chocolate chip cookie or the existing routine and procedure. Plato, more than 2,000 years ago, had a charioteer, that's the rational side, the analytical side, reining in an unruly horse, that's the emotional side of ourselves. Freud talked about the superego and the id. Modern behavioral economist Dick Thaler won the Nobel Prize a couple of years ago, and his model, planner and doer model. The planner is the part of our brain that says, I need to write that memo in the morning. And so optimistically sets the alarm for 5:30 in the morning. But it turns out that the planner is not in charge of the hand at 5:30 a.m. in the morning. That's the doer, and the doer has a different idea about how to spend the next 15, 20 minutes, a little snooze action. But my favorite analogy for this in the entire history of thought is by a modern psychologist named Jonathan Haidt. He teaches at NYU. And he says that emotional side of ourself, that's like a big elephant. And that big elephant's being ridden by a tiny human rider that represents the analytical side of ourselves. And what I love about Jonathan Haidt's metaphor is the entire history of thought, he's the only one who gets the relative weight classes right about these two sides of ourselves. Now, you may have heard the voice of the elephant in your past. It may have spoken to you at critical moments, said, go ahead, eat the whole quart. You're halfway there already, you might as well just finish it up. Next one, you may have to cast your mind back maybe to a time in college when you met and fell in love with the person you were going to marry, and then you broke up. And so there may have been a time, maybe late at night, maybe after a couple of drinks that you shouldn't have had, when your elephant spoke to you. Said, call your ex. I think she'd really like to hear from you right about now. Now look, that's a lie that your elephant's telling you. But the elephant doesn't always lie to us. Here's an elephant saying, wouldn't it be cool too? Wouldn't it be cool to organize the world's information and have it available at our fingertips? That's the Google, wouldn't it be cool? And it built a pretty incredible company over the last 20, 30 years. Here's another one. That's wrong. Everything that's ever changed for the better in your business has happened because somebody said, that's wrong that we're doing things that way. It's inefficient. That's wrong that we're doing things that way. It's not right by customers. Everything that's ever changed for the better in society has happened because somebody had an elephant reaction, and that's wrong. That's wrong that we're excluding that group of people from voting. So the elephant is not always the bad guy. But I want to suggest that the rider's not always the good guy either. And this is more controversial because you're an analytical crowd. But if you've ever spun your wheels, if you've ever overthought or overanalyzed a decision, you may have been a victim of an overactive rider. If you've ever used 9 statistics in a presentation when 2 might have done just as well, you might have been a victim of an overactive rider. If you've ever wasted a lot of time and gas looking for the cheapest price on gas, You may have been a victim of an overactive rider. Elephant's not always the villain, but change happens when we align these two different sides of ourselves. And so how do we do that? Well, there's a simple framework, 3 parts. First is you're going to provide direction to the rider. Now notice what I'm not saying is argue with the rider, because the rider loves to argue. The rider loves to debate. And should we go, should we stay? And there's no progress being made when the rider is debating the change. What you want to do is provide direction to the rider. You want to say, what if we could get there? And all of a sudden you start harnessing that analytical capacity of the rider, not to debate whether we stay or we go, but say, oh, how would I get there? Well, maybe I could go there and then tack back this way, and maybe then I'll get to the destination. So you want to provide direction to the rider. Second thing you want to do is provide motivation to the elephant. Most journeys of change take a while, and no journey of change is going to last very long without the strength and passion and energy of that elephant side of ourselves. So provide motivation for the elephant. Third thing you want to do is shape the path. What if you could take all the obstacles out of the path? What if you could mark it out with good road signs so the rider and elephant never got lost? What if you could tilt it downhill and slick it with Teflon so that even a reluctant elephant would slide along a little bit? So 3 parts for change. I'm going to tell you a little bit about those and then commend you to the changes that you're going to go back home and make. First principle is directing the rider, and it turns out the rider's Achilles heel is that the rider loves problems. And there's been lots of research done on this. Let me tell you about a couple of the studies. And you don't even speak the language at the time. Where would you even start? Well, what Sterner did was he went to one village and convened a meeting of mothers in that village. And you want to talk about a situation where you don't have to motivate the elephant. You talk to a group of moms and you say, would you like your kids to be healthier? And the moms say, yeah, I'm all in favor of that. But what do I do? Notice that's a question for the rider. Which direction do we go? So Sterner handed out a scale and a measuring tape. And he said, let's go weigh and measure every child in the village. And so the moms did. They went out and collected the data. And they came back with it, and they started looking through it. And Sterner said, are there any kids growing up in the village right now today that are healthier than the other kids? And they looked through the data, and there was one. And there was one. And there was one. And Sterner said, let's go study those bright spots. Now, it turns out there's some conventional wisdom in the village about how you eat meals with your family. And families would eat 2 meals a day together. And what you offer to your child as a parent is the best that you had to offer. A bowl of white, pure, beautiful rice. But you go look at the bright spot families, and things look a little different. So they're not eating 2 meals a day together, they're eating 4 meals a day. No more rice than anyone else, but it's broken up into smaller units. And instead of that bowl of white, pure rice, there's weird stuff mixed in with the rice. The bright spot moms are mixing in sweet potato greens, which is commonly regarded as a very low-class food. They're mixing in, there were these tiny brine shrimp that would grow in the rice paddies about the size of your thumbnail. And adults would eat them because they added a kind of nice crunch and texture to the rice, but it was understood that you don't feed those to your kids. And yet the bright spot moms were feeding the brine shrimp to the kids. Now, you all have theories of nutrition that tell you what was going on. Those moms were adding protein and vitamins to their kids' diet. But notice that those moms didn't have to have a theory of nutrition. They had a practice, and that practice was working. And you look at that practice and you say, we can scale this. And so they started calling together groups of families that were interested in their kids being healthier. And the price of admission for finding out some hints about that was you show up every night for a week to a dinner, and you bring a handful of brine shrimp and a handful of sweet potato greens. And the bright spot moms teach the other moms how to fix the rice, and the kids get used to eating the rice with the weird crunchy stuff in it. Nobody else is dying, and so it must be okay. And within 7 days, you have a new habit that you've established. And you break apart that group, and you bring another group together. And you do that over and over, and within 6 months, 65% of the kids in the village were measurably better nourished. And they stayed that way. There were researchers that came into this village several years after the Sternans had left, and they found that kids growing up in that village that hadn't even been born when the Sternans were there were growing up healthier than kids in outlying villages that hadn't been through this process. The then a remarkable thing did happen. Other villages heard what had gone on in the first village, and so they sent representatives to say, what did you do? And the answer in all the other villages was almost never again brine shrimp and sweet potato greens. But in every village, there were bright spot families that were raising healthier kids. And if you look at what they were doing with local foodstuffs, with local cultural traditions, if you looked at what the bright spot families were doing, you could imitate it and scale it. And so in total, this program ended up reaching 2.2 million people in Vietnam. Now let's pause for a moment and think how ludicrous that was. There's a whole country filled with poor rice farming families. One of the things about elephants is that the emotion of the elephant is that they're easily demoralized in many situations. And so if you point out a trajectory that's a long way away, it's easy for the elephant to feel like, journey's a little bit too long, it's going to be too hard. And you all are embarked in a big change. And so the question is, how do you pitch that big change to the people that you're working with? And what I want to recommend is that instead of pitching the whole thing all at once as a big swath, what you might want to do is shrink the change a little bit. Make it change look more close in physical and in social problems. Suppose that we gave people credit for what they're already doing that's consistent with the direction we're going. A couple of psychologists that were interested in this notion of shrinking the change did a loyalty card experiment with a mom and pop car wash. And you know how these go. You have them in, you buy 8 lattes and you get your 9th one free. You buy 8 slices of pizza, 8 pizzas and you get your 9th one free. Well, this car wash had a loyalty program that you buy 8 car washes and you get your 9th one free. And so the researchers took the standard card that they had that was devoted to this task, and they created an additional card. Now, you all are a very economically savvy audience, and so you're looking at that and saying, there's no difference between those 2 cards. And economically, that's exactly right, because in both cases, you've got to get 8 more car washes to get your 9th one free. But notice the card on the right, you're already making progress relative to your goal. You're already 20% of the way there. You've got 2 stamps on your loyalty card. And sure enough, over the next few months, 19% of those folks got 8 car washes and got their 9th one free, but 31% of those folks. Now, that's a pretty good increase in market share for a mom and pop car wash for an absolutely trivial expense on marketing. And it happens because you take a group of people that don't feel like they're making progress and you give them a head start, give them 2 stamps on their loyalty card. Your role, if you want the elephant to respond well, is to shrink that change. And I don't know what that's going to look like in your situation, but you've got to figure out ways of doing it. So nonprofit fundraisers know the following thing. If you're going to raise $5 million for the new playhouse, for the new soup kitchen program, you don't announce it until you have $2 million in the bag. And so you say to people, we're going to build a new playhouse. It's going to cost $5 million. And everybody goes, oh. Say, we've already got pledges of $2 million. And people go, oh. And that's the response that you're going for. That feeling of shrinking the change, that feeling that the elephant is already getting momentum. Give people credit for where they've already come. All right, final principle, shape the path. There is a world out there. There's a world outside of this weird conflict that goes on inside of our heads between the rider and the elephant. They call it the fundamental attribution error. And what psychologists say is that the fundamental mistake that we make in analyzing the world, in attributing why things happen in the world, is we focus on people rather than the situation they're in. And the principle and the luxury of this is that to change behavior, very often we don't have to change people. All we've got to do is change their environment. And that's much easier in many situations. Here's a follow-up question. How many of you knew that Amazon had a patent on one-click ordering? Anybody? About 3% of you? Isn't that remarkable? You can't get a patent on something if anybody in the history of the world has ever done that thing before you do it. And this has been a controversial patent because you would expect that in all the firms doing e-commerce, somebody would have come up with a version of one-click. And they can't find any prior art, so the patent is held up. Amazon has a patent on one-click ordering because they were the only people that took the time to take away every barrier between a customer and a purchase and make it as simple as one click. How many, and I know this is an unfair question to ask at 10 a.m. on a final morning of conference. But let me pose it. Are there any processes or procedures that might benefit from one clicking in your business? Now, I thought Amazon had done, well, first, before we can get to that, today you can not only buy with one click, you can have it downloaded in under a minute to your Kindle, right? Device that sells for about $80, so they've made that. And I thought the Kindle was the ultimate. You mount it, you put the Tide button by the laundry, you can put the refill on diapers button by the child's changing table, but you press that button, and 3 days later, with your Prime membership, your Tide arrives on your doorstep, courtesy of Amazon. You didn't have to write it down, you didn't have to remember it, you didn't have to think about it all the way from the upstairs to the downstairs. You just press the button, and it arrives, it shows up. Amazon is still thinking about how do we shrink the change. Now, we've talked about lots of things. Fundamentally, there's a very simple model for change. And it involves shaping the path. I mean, Amazon has a patent on one-click ordering. Nobody else thought that carefully about taking away the obstacles in the path between the rider and the elephant and the destination that they're wanting. You're going to motivate the elephant. You're going to give people credit for where they've already come and how far you've already gone towards where you need to go. And by shrinking the change, by making the destination look closer, you're going to motivate the elephant to be enthusiastic about pursuing what remains in that change. And finally, you're going to direct the rider. Jerry Sternin walked into an absolutely hopeless situation. Very, very poor rice farming families, malnutrition. And he saw something that I don't think the rest of us would have seen. And that is that by looking at what's going well already, we're going to be ahead of the game. You all are masters of change. When I ask you to evaluate the biggest change in your life, you are optimistic about it. And I hope with these tools you can be even more optimistic.